Well, efforts to recalibrate those Canada-China relations come after years of icy relations. It all soured in 2018 after Canada arrested Chinese telecom executive Meng Wanzhou on behalf of the U.S. over bank fraud charges. Days later, China detained Canadian diplomats Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor over arbitrary spying allegations. Both men were eventually released after spending more than 1,000 days in a Chinese prison. I'm joined now by Michael Kovrig. He was, of course, one of the men detained in China for nearly 3 years. He's now a senior Asia advisor for the International Crisis Group. Michael Kovrig, it's good to meet you. Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to join you.
So despite your personal experience with China, you've expressed support for what the Prime Minister is doing here. Well, why do you think this is a good move?
Because dialogue is essential, but there's a difference between dialogue and trust, or having illusions about the realities of China. The reality is, it was the Chinese that cut off diplomatic contact in 2018, and that led to this multi-year freeze in relations. Canada has been trying to talk to China ever since to resolve issues, and challenges are piling up between the two countries. So Mark Carney is doing something that's absolutely necessary. But the question is not, the purpose is not just to have the meeting, it's to create leverage and assess what the other side wants. And then you use the meetings to employ that leverage to defend Canadian interests and pursue Canadian things that Canada wants to buy from China, to sell to China, and to do deals and make arrangements, while at the same time having very clear red lines about things like national security and sovereignty and interference in Canadian politics or harming Canadian citizens. And it's only by being in the room with Xi Jinping and Li Qiang and other Chinese leaders that you can actually fight your corner.
When you talk about finding leverage, how does a middle power country of about 40 million people like Canada find leverage against the superpower of more than 1 billion people that is China? Well, what sort of areas can Canada look to exploit there?
Well, first of all, look at the timing, right? It's not an accident that Xi Jinping decided in November that this was a turning point, and now China suddenly wants to talk to Canada. Why did that happen, right? China wants things from Canada. Xi Jinping doesn't do this out of the goodness of his heart. He wants things. So it's about understanding what kind of things he wants. China's economy is having a lot of problems. They're struggling in a whole range of sectors, even while a few others are doing very well. And so he's looking for ways to solve those problems, and he's looking to get unnecessary problems off his desk so that he can focus on the major challenge he has in front of him internationally, which is dealing with Donald Trump. The tariffs and all the other challenges that are in the increasingly intensifying US-China rivalry are a real headache for Xi Jinping. And so he sees an opportunity now, with Canada under pressure from the United States as well, to drive wedges between these countries, to try to pull Canada away from the United States and other countries as much as he can. And he's got a procession of Western leaders coming to see him over these months. Right? Early last year, France's president, last week, South Korea, next week, Keir Starmer. He wants to try to improve relations to show that China is the responsible, stable, not necessarily likable, but stable great power in the world, and that countries should follow its lead and do Beijing's bidding and not listen to what Donald Trump says.
There are obvious things that we see from what Canada is looking to sell to China that would be things that they need, right? Oil, gas, energy is right at the top of the list. But, the U.S. just took pretty severe action against Venezuela, in part because they are giving oil and energy products to China. So how do you calibrate it in such a way that you can reopen some sort of a productive relationship with China without antagonizing the great power to the south?
That's one of the tightropes that Mark Carney is walking today and tomorrow in Beijing, right? He needs to signal to the Chinese that Canada is open for business within a certain set of sectors, right? There are still a lot of investment restrictions and careful and heavy investment screening, and trade needs to be managed so that it avoids technically sensitive sectors that relate to defense, high technology, some kinds of scientific research, critical minerals, AI, but that in other areas, as you said, energy, agriculture, non-controversial things like selling the Chinese more dog food, that there is money to be made and there isn't likely to be harm, as long as you don't allow the Chinese share of that trade to be too excessive, which was the mistake that was made with canola. And then at the same time, it has to be triangulated with US relations to make sure that it's not crossing a US red line either and creating more problems even while you're resolving them in Beijing. So it's a very complicated triangular diplomacy that he has to work through.
So when it comes to the Canada-China, keep it focused, keep it limited, keep it transactional, essentially. Don't get into technology transfer, strategic partnerships necessarily in a way that could compromise your interests. And I guess one of the key steps too, Michael Kovrig, is don't shift your over-reliance on one unreliable superpower to an over-reliance on another potential superpower.
That's right.
Exactly. Calibrate that.
You need, the key word for all of Canada's international relations this year should be diversification, right? You need a multitude of partners. So it's okay to increase trade with China overall, as long as that's balanced by increased trade with other, preferably more democratic or at least reliable and trustworthy and stable partners that are not potential security threats, right? Most middle power countries are not security threats, and they're not likely to be in a position to weaponize any interdependence that Canada has with them. But I would caveat a couple of things that you suggested there. I wouldn't keep it transactional, because that's part of the problem, and that's exactly what the Chinese Communist Party tries to exploit. Western democratic capitalists come in looking to just go deal by deal and have a transactional relationship. But the Chinese link everything, and they will lead you down the garden path with a series of transactions that then may in fact end up with you compromising your freedoms, your sovereignty, your democracy, and your national security. So in fact, all of those deals need to be seen in a strategic framework based on principled realism that takes a long view, not a short view, not a purely transactional view, but a geopolitical view. Are we creating unnecessary and risky dependencies in this sector? And that's where you need a real interaction between government and business. Firms are just going to try to maximize profits, of course, but government has to step in and say, wait a minute, selling 90% of your canola to one buyer that is also a hostile great power, maybe not a good idea.
Yeah, that is a very good caveat to put in there. Because when you go back, it wasn't that long ago, Michael Kovrig, that Canada was referring to China as a disruptive global power. NATO has listed it as a strategic risk. And yet what is happening with the United States and in the United States right now is pushing the diversification efforts towards a country that would have not that long ago maybe been considered the #1 risk to Canada's economic and political security. So what does success look like coming out of this meeting, coming out of this trip for Prime Minister Carney, given all the challenges, the caveats, and that tightrope diplomacy that you talked about a second ago?
Right, exactly. So the key question there, right? How does Carney balance stronger economic ties with China without compromising on Canadian values? I think success looks like limited, reversible progress in a few key economic sectors where you can trade safely with China. Framework agreement, it looks like, toward things like selling more oil and natural gas over time. Attracting Chinese investment into sectors where it's not controversial or harmful, and ideally getting relief on tariffs in key areas for Canadian exports that are currently blocked. So short answer, how do you do things very carefully with lots of safeguards, keeping Canadians safe, protecting their rights, protecting democratic processes, and ensuring national security is a red line in any negotiation. So the real question coming out of these meetings is, does he bring us closer to agreements that are deliberate, durable, and defensible rather than unconditional trade? And again, that also needs to be balanced by understanding that the diplomacy is strategic and that you don't create new vulnerabilities by deepening relations. So a key element of success is not just what happens when Mark Carney gets on the plane back home, or in this case to the Middle East, but what does Canada do after that to manage the risks of any increase in relations with China?
Michael Kovrig, Asia Senior Advisor with the International Crisis Group. Thank you for your time today, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to start there with the Power Panel. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Tim Powers has worked as a strategist for Conservative parties. Stevie O'Brien is a former chief of staff to Liberal cabinet ministers. And Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. It's good to see you all. Andrew, as someone formerly in Saskatchewan government, the Saskatchewan premier is there in those pictures with Mark Carney. Nothing yet on canola, but interesting to see Melanie Joly talking about China and reliability and stability. What do you make of what we've seen on the trip so far?
Well, certainly from the perspective of the West and the Western economy, this is a pretty important one, not just because of the pressure that's been placed on the canola markets with the Chinese tariffs and the pressure and that's put on the agriculture sector. Obviously, China is also a large market for potash. And potentially going to be a very large market for whatever oil may come out of that Asian pipeline that Danielle Smith is pushing for, that West Coast pipeline. Mm-hmm. So, from an economic standpoint, this is pretty important. I think the question that really sits here, though, is what is the rationale for this? What is the approach? What is it we look for from China as a concession beyond simply the economic benefit? I do think there's a certain, genuine need to reset. I don't think that there's a real benefit by leaving China isolated or moving into this kind of where the Americans look to be moving with this multipolar world where they've got control of the Western Hemisphere, potentially with a bit of Europe. Russia's, struggling to figure out what its dynasty looks like, and China essentially runs the rest of the board. That's not a very helpful position for a country like us. It's not very stable position in terms of geopolitics. So there's probably a number of things that Carney's looking at, the Prime Minister is looking at. Certainly the economic piece, huge. We do need to find some resolution to that. But there are, I suspect, many other issues on the table also.
But, Shachi, we spoke to Michael Kovrig off the top of the show, and we are in a different time, I guess, but it wasn't that long ago, right? That we were counting down the days of arbitrary detention of Canadian citizens, and everyone was talking about China as the #1 strategic global challenge in a lot of ways. And here we are. I mean, how do you think the country views this in terms of whether there is broad-based support for this type of re-engagement?
It's all within a continuum of, I think, who represents the greater threat. And so Canadians continue to view China with a pretty jaded eye. There's only about 27% of Canadians who view China favorably. That's not a lot. But at the same time, it's up from the 10% who viewed the country favorably back in October of 21, shortly after Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor's release from China after their extrajudicial kidnapping. Here's the catch. As I say, people are not exactly warm towards China, but here's who they're even colder towards at the moment in terms of public opinion. It's the United States. Right now, the U.S. has a higher unfavorable level with Canadians. More Canadians view that country unfavorably. More Canadians deem that country a greater threat, potential enemy to Canada than they do China. It doesn't mean that, we're all feeling warm and cuddly as falling, rolling pandas at the moment when it comes to that country, but it does say that call it the Carney doctrine around, we have to kind of pick our poison here. We've got to do business with somebody. We don't necessarily have to like these countries. We don't have to laud these countries. We don't have to have the warm and fuzzies towards them, but we do have to be able to do business. I think that is a message that's starting to land and resonate. And I look back to data that shows that in October of 2021, the number of Canadians saying we need to prioritize trade and investment opportunities with China was only at about 1 in 5, about 23%. Today, that number has more than doubled. It's at about 50%. So I think, Canadians remain under no illusion as to the human rights challenges, the geopolitical threats, right. The bellicose nature of China towards Taiwan. That's all part of the picture. But the other part of the picture is we've got an even bigger problem in the eyes of many Canadians just immediately south of the border.
So Stevie, like we didn't see seismic altering agreements or anything today. It's memorandums of understanding for the most part to move ahead in some key sectors, mostly to open up the market, you know, for maybe increased oil production, gas production, selling pet food, which actually helps the agriculture sector in the country. What do you make of the way the Prime Minister has approached this and what success might look like? Because later tonight or tomorrow morning in China, he's meeting with President Xi, and that's kind of where I guess the big decisions get made.
I haven't given up all hope that there's going to be any movement or announcements on tariffs. So we'll see what tomorrow holds. But even if there isn't any additional announcements, what we've seen Carney doing is exactly what he said he was going to do during the election, which was, you know, focus on economic growth, build Canada strong, and look for and trade diversification so that we can double our non-US exports within the next 10 years. That's what's been behind this trip and all of his other trips around Europe and the rest of the world. So I think he's focusing on the right thing. I think we need to trade with somebody. I think that Canadian producers of many products and many natural resources are looking to markets. And isn't it crazy that we can do business better right now with China than we can with the United States, and that we're more comfortable in doing so?
Well, I mean, we'll see, right? Like, you know, we'll see on that because, like, the scale and volume of the trade, it's they're our number 2 trading partner, Tim, but I think it's like 3% of exports as opposed to 75% with the U.S., right? And while that has been disrupted, it's a non-market economy on the other side of the Pacific, and we'll see where they land on all of these things. But what does success look like for Mark Carney? Can he come back without any movement on the tariffs? Because there's an internal calibration on that with the prairies and Ontario. And of course, Donald Trump and MAGA are paying attention to whatever he does.
Well, and don't forget our region too, seafood, right? I mean, that's a huge issue that we haven't heard much about. I note that the Minister of Fisheries is not there. The Minister of Agriculture is not either. I think you can give PMO credit for this. They have kept the expectations down so low because I think they're showing a wisdom about dealing with China. It's a mixture of elbows up and a snail-like pace, right? China does things in a slow, deliberate manner, so you're not going to get things happen quickly. I don't know if there's a scorecard that will be inflated and scored against for Carney's trip to China. He will still get criticism from the opposition about, you know, is he trading economic opportunity for values? And we've seen this demarcated a little bit. The Conservatives are pushing very much a values-based agenda as opposed to a pragmatic economic agenda. But you also then can go look back at Harper, who went to China in 2014, and tried to reset the relationship. You can't but be a Canadian Prime Minister and try to have some sort of economic relationship with China. I don't think David will know the success or failure of this trip for a while. MOUs, as we well know, are not deals. They're notes of intention. And as Campbell Clark well wrote in the Globe and Mail yesterday, even when you have deals with the Chinese, they're going to do what they want to do when it suits them to do it. So ultimately, as Mark Carney in Canada moves forward here, the best thing we can look for, as well as what kind of protections, if any, in a WTO-free world, can we get for Canada if we are going to go into these markets?
Right. I just want to say Heath MacDonald, the agriculture minister, is in China, is my understanding. He's part. He was on the list.
Yes, sorry, I said the fisheries minister wasn't there. The agriculture minister is there.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I misheard. Yeah, you're right in that case. Stevie, you were looking to jump in. There was something? Go ahead.
Oh, no, I mean, it's not like Carney is there signing security agreements or, extradition treaties or inviting China into the Five Eyes. I think you can have legitimate security concerns and act accordingly. And you can also do trade and open up markets and do business.